Part 4 of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front, by Leslie Buswell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pont-à-Mousson, August 15, 1915. Yesterday was a red-letter day for me. I was made so happy that I feared something bad must happen to counteract it. The American mail arrived. 12 letters. From H.S., J.H., C.B., C.S.S., S., E.T., etc., and my uncle and mother. I wonder whether you people out there in the sunshine of peace can realize what a ray of joy and encouragement the letters you are writing to us here bring. I got this packet about 4 o'clock, and being on X duty took them up there to read. I sat in my car with the sun streaming down over us in that little village semi-blue with soldiers, and started first to contemplate the writing and the dates on the envelopes. A battery of 75s were firing on my left, and we heard the shells whistling overhead, and after a few seconds the boom of the explosion on my right. Even the shells seemed to be singing with pleasure and excitement. Then I was brought back to actualities by the voice of a young French soldier, of about 21, who stood beside me. "You just have letters?" "Yes, not even opened yet." "All those! You are to be married, perhaps?" "No, my friend." "Surely it is your mother, then, who has written so often?" "Only this one is from her," I answered. And then a strange silence fell. I did not feel like speaking, for glancing up I realized that he was still looking at that one letter in my hand. After a few moments, fumbling in his uniform, he pulled out a packet of earth-stained letters. "These were from my mother, but I can no longer look for them. She died last month." Perhaps it was that little incident that made me appreciate so tremendously these messages from home. But when I got into bed last night and lit a candle by my side to reread them all, and when my mother's turn came, I found the link with that boy and realized how much he has lost, and how he must treasure and find comfort in that little batch of memories in his pocket. They, too, were probably full of anxiety for his welfare, full of encouragement and confidence in his doing his duty as a true Frenchwoman's son. And then my imagination wandered to another side, the letters from the front, the letters of assurance, of counsel not to worry, and next, perhaps the citation for gallantry, the pride and happiness of those at home. Finally, that most dreaded letter, or the brief announcement in the list of those morts au champ d'honneur. Are we really living in the 20th century after 1900 years of teaching of supposed civilization and Christianity? The day before yesterday, after having made several trips with wounded, I had a pressing call to Auberge St-Pierre. There the Germans were bombarding as usual, and it was unpleasant. A shell had landed near a kitchen, killing several and seriously wounding one soldier. He had a hole as big as your fist right through his back. There is a chance if you can get him to the operating room quickly, I was told. It was 18 kilometers to the best surgeon. So off dear old No. 10 and I started on our rush for life. Toot-toot-toot! And even the soldiers, realizing that I had a man's life in my care, made a clear way in the road ahead, and through village after village, without moving the throttle, we sped on and on. Bump, bump, bump. What did it matter if I had to shake him about a little? He was unconscious, and every second counted. "I hope I won't have a puncture," I found myself muttering from time to time. Finally I turned to the left, then another corner, and blowing my horn I drew up at the tent. In a second 2 brancardiers had the car unloaded, the surgeon in white was washing his hands, and 30 minutes from the time my charge was given into my care he was lying on the operating table. "He may live," said the surgeon. That was my reward. That is why I am happy, even here, only for this reason: one sometimes saves lives and never intentionally kills. The other day I went up to the top of Mousson, i.e. the hill the other side of the bridge. It is under another army division, and so we have to get special permission from the colonel, but as our section is treated so wonderfully, there is no difficulty in procuring it. We first stopped at the graveyard and tried to find poor Mignot's grave, but in that mess of debris, overturned sepulchres, upheaved tombstones, burst open coffins, sun-bleached bones, and the 100 new-made graves, we could not find it. We would have continued our search, but an officer told us not to stay any longer, as we were in easy view of the Germans, and they might bombard at any moment. We started to go to the summit. Up the hill we climbed, and the little mountainside was all pitted with shell holes, some of them most discomfortingly new. At last we reached the top and began to look about. A few minutes after, having asked a soldier some questions, we found ourselves surrounded and rather roughly asked for our pass. We showed it with the colonel's signature, and then followed a hearty laugh when they had to confess they thought our foreign accent was Boche. We asked in what direction Metz was, and there, just over the hill, to the right of a little tree we stood facing, it lay, and like some glorious dominating giant stood out the cathedral, built by the French for the worship of God and teaching of Christianity, and now so kept by the Germans, the race which has set loose the scourge. If I could only be in the procession that marches in triumph to Metz! I must tell you just one more incident. The other evening I was walking down the street when an excited shout made me stop, and I saw running toward me an old friend, one I knew when I was in London, now dressed in the blue of France. "What on earth are you doing here?" I asked. "Tell me, how in the name of all that's possible did you get out to the front?" he replied, and then we set to and talked. He is a French artist who lived in London and entered the French army, as the English would not have him. He, knowing I had not passed the military medical, could not get over the fact that I had arrived here notwithstanding. He dragged me to a group of his friends, and we all had a happy half-hour. Then the usual handshake and au revoir. As I turned away he followed me. "I go to Carte en Reserve to-night for some days. Probably I shall not return whole. If I am a bit knocked out, you will know, and if I am killed, my people will know. It would be hard for my wife wondering whether I was seriously hurt or not. She is about to have a child. Supposing I am wounded, will you post this letter? It only says that I am getting on well, am but slightly wounded, and that she is not to worry." I add no comment to the story, but I do wish you could realize what trench life means to the infantry when they know they have to go to a hell like the Carte en Reserve. I know what I feel like when I have to drive along a road being bombarded by the Germans, but that is only for 5 or 6 minutes. But think of 5 or 6 days with scarcely an hour's rest out of the 24. No wonder we have to carry madmen to the hospital sometimes. August 19th. Poor old No. 10 has been ill, so I have had her engine down and cleaned it. Now she is running finely. There is an American stationed here who enlisted in the French army. Poor boy, he is only 20. We asked him to dinner. "Why did you enlist?" "Well, I guess I wanted to see some action." "Are you satisfied?" "Satisfied? Well, I came here to see life and movement. All I see in my ditch are worms, spiders, marmites, and torpedoes." "So you have changed your mind?" "No, I guess my mind is the same as when I enlisted. I wanted to see war. I still do. I haven't seen war. I have seen murder and cultivated systematic butchery." There has been a lot of permission for the soldiers here, and they are now returning after their 8 days — the first 8 days in 12 months, the first time they have seen their wives and mothers for a year, and in many cases they have their first look at their own children born in their absence. One soldier I asked whether his wife was pleased to see him. "Ah," he said, "you should have seen her cry when I left." "But when you arrived?" I asked. "She was pleased." "Ah, mon Dieu, you should have seen her cry when I arrived." August 20th. Today has been a villainous one. The French bombarded the German stores and set fire to some large storage space. We think petrol and stores. Perhaps the petrol they sprayed lighted into our trenches, and from 12 o'clock till now the whole sky has been black with smoke. Of course the Germans made reprisals, and every little town around was bombarded. One shell, which burst where 9 persons were sitting dining, killed them all. The telephone bell rings. 2 cars wanted at once for L. August 23rd. About 10:45 this morning a German aeroplane came over the town, not 250 meters high. We could see the pilot and observer and the 4 Maltese crosses on the planes. It was one of the bravest acts I have seen. She was too low for the artillery to open up fire, so the soldiers fired at her with their rifles, and although it seemed as if she must have been hit, the pilot turned around and flew safely back to the German lines. This little incident leaves us with a very uneasy feeling, as we think no German would have taken such risk unless the mission had been very important. He must have seen everything he wanted to. Our cars are fairly conspicuous with their crosses on the top of the canvas. He dropped signals as he flew over our house, and we are wondering just what is to follow and when. August 30th. The Germans, not satisfied with the reprisals they took on the 22nd for the burning by the French of stores and factory at Pagny, again opened up on certain buildings of a neighboring town on August 22. They sent over 150 shells between 2 o'clock and 7. All large marmites, 2 10s, 2 80s, and I believe some larger. The damage done is considerable, but after such a bombardment it was marvelous that anything remained. Over 33 shells fell in the road. It happened to be my day of repose, and I was asked if I would care to go to Nancy for the day, so at 7 o'clock in the morning I appeared in full parade uniform, so to speak, and except that I hadn't the heart to shave off my temporary moustache, I am sure I must have cut quite a figure. Off we went to Nancy, and spent an interesting day looking all over that wonderful town. Salisbury, as you know, has got the Croix de Guerre, and we all felt very proud parading the street with him and his significant ribbon. While the 2 men with me went to have a haircut, which I happened to feel no impulse to do, I stayed outside in the car. I noticed 4 Moroccans walking down the street, and casually thought how picturesque their red fezzes looked against their blue uniform, when to my horror they stopped by my car and started saluting and bowing and talking so ostentatiously that it took exactly 30 seconds for a large crowd of Nancy inhabitants to collect. The mere fact of being in town for the first time in 12 weeks was quite strange, but to find myself surrounded by a quantity of civilians and the center of attraction was, to say the least, most embarrassing. It was a hot day, and I felt the perspiration pouring down my back as I looked to right and left for a way of escape. But my trial was not over. Horrors! My hand was taken, and all 4 soldiers solemnly bowed over it and kissed it. I did not know what to do, being anxious not to offend them, nor to add to the amusement of the onlooking civilians. I thanked them in the name of America for the honor they were paying her, and brought down on my unsuspecting hand a renewal of the embrace. Suddenly, joy! What was that? An Irish voice! "Sure, young man, it's an uncomfortable sore ye are this minute." And an old fellow emerged from the multitude bristling with the hope of a brawl. However, he calmly joined forces with me, and we presently left the crowd with as much dignity as was possible under the circumstances. From him I heard all about the war, and as much, if not more, about Ireland, as we sat in a public house across the street. So ended an awkward encounter. Well, we left Nancy about 5:30. I had bought cakes and various luxuries for the boys, and when we arrived just outside R, about 6:30, we saw to our surprise the effects of the bombardments on buildings and the road. Uncertain whether to take a chance or not, we drove nearer and were still hesitating when a shell burst 100 yards down the road and decided us. Not being on duty, we had no reason to go to Pont-à-Mousson, so turning around we went to dinner at Toul. After a good meal we started home, and arriving at my room at 11:30, I was relieved to hear that no one had been injured. Several big éclats, however, had fallen in our garden, and 2 of our cars had very narrow escapes. A strange thing to me was the sense of dissatisfaction, of subconscious restlessness I felt while in Nancy. It was the first time for 12 weeks I had been in a civilized town, where everything was going on as usual. It all seemed so artificial, so futile and aimless. As our car tooted home, I turned around and exclaimed, "Oh, Lord, how glad I am to get back again to our dear old peaceful bit of country!" Rather Irish, but quite sincere. The other day I had 2 hours off duty, and McConnell and I went for a walk along the Moselle. We saw several soldiers bathing, and decided it would be a good idea to do likewise. It was a gloriously hot day, so the fact that we had no towels was unimportant. I confess I became Anglais to the extent of insisting on walking along the bank until we got away from everyone and could bathe alone. At last we found a quiet corner and started to undress, but we had been noticed. "C'est les Américains!" and before we could realize it, some soldiers were hurriedly preparing to swim in the Moselle with us, so our bath became a real party. I only tell this little incident to show again how ready the soldiers always are to join and talk to members of our little section. September 4th. A sad thing happened the other day to a friend of mine, a poilu who had been helping me to get specimens of perfect empty German shells, those which have arrived but not exploded. The fellow was an expert at dismounting them, a very dangerous task, and when he had entirely emptied them, used to bring them to me. I had many a long talk with him, and he got quite fond of American tobacco. Poilus don't usually care for English tobacco. He used to like to tell me about his girl, and how happy they were together before the war, and how the day peace was declared he was going to marry her. Lately I had noticed he looked depressed, and one day I found out the reason. I was in his little cellar, sitting on a block of wood, talking of America, and he of France, when the postman came to the door. He looked at my friend, who had become alert, and shaking his head said, "Pas encore," and murmuring "Salut" to me, continued his walk with his precious letters from home. My friend became very white, and presently confessed to me that he had had no letters for 6 weeks. 42 days! That seems a terribly long time out here, you know. A few days after I saw him again, and asked if he had heard from his girl. He said no, very sullenly, but later, over a glass of beer, he mentioned that his father had written to say his girl had been misbehaving herself. The poor fellow seemed stunned with the news. After vainly trying to cheer him up, I went back to dinner. The next morning I did not see him, being on Montauville duty, but the following morning I was at headquarters when an urgent call came for an ambulance. My car happened to be just going, so I took the trip. "Where was the house?" I asked. "Just over there where the man is waving." It was the house of my friend. Need I end the story? A broken man who had worked valiantly for 12 months under hellish conditions to defend his country had shot himself. We lifted him onto a stretcher. Then, feeling pretty badly, and with the doctor's urgent warning against loss of time ringing in my ears, we, number 10 and I, sped away to B. They took him out of my car, read the little pink fiche which is attached to every wounded soldier, and filled in by the doctor who has dressed him in the first poste de secours, and then exchanged glances. I knew those glances not only meant that life was nearly extinct, but that it did not much matter whether he recovered or not, as he would get 6 years' imprisonment if he got well for attempted suicide, and that sentence, in wartime, means constant first-line trench work. I followed him into the operating room, where he opened his eyes, and I think he recognized me. His lips moved, but I don't know. The other night came a hurried call to Crawdads for a poor fellow who had kept his grenade too long and was very badly shattered. "Just a chance if you get him to the hospital quickly," said the doctor. How many times I have felt quite elated at this injunction and literally flown to the Belleville hospital. But in this instance I had that horrible sense of hopelessness. It was dark and quite impossible to make Belleville under an hour and a quarter. The poor fellow died before I could get there. Today I took all the carbon out of the car and put in a new commutator. A quiet and lonely day. I feel homesick. The German offensive, which I thought might take place yesterday, did not. The French got news of the fact and of the hour that they proposed to attack, and 5 minutes beforehand the 75's opened up, and catching many of the Germans already in their first line of trenches, so demoralized them as to wholly disrupt their intention. We had only about 10 wounded, but goodness knows how many they lost. September 6th. I forgot to mention a very important event in the history of the section. After the Blenneau attack, Walter and I went to see the damage done. We found the havoc was pretty bad. We were talking to some men who had actually been in a room where a shell exploded and had not even been wounded, when a soldier joined us and, speaking in good English, asked if we would like to have some English papers. Although we felt pretty sure they wouldn't contain very recent news, we had to show an eager appreciation and asked him if he would go and fetch them. We followed him to his lodging. He presently emerged with a large parcel of quite old papers and began chatting with us. London was mentioned, and we soon discovered that he had been chef for some friends of mine, and had, after leaving them, become chef to Lord Fisher. I think I told you that our chef was an undertaker before the war, and his cooking was such that we wonder he did not achieve a lot of patrons in our section. When we got back to the bureau, we decided to ask the governor of Pont-à-Mousson to allow us to have Cosson, for that was his name, as our chef, and of course our request was immediately acceded to. So now we are having food de luxe, and the singe, as they call the American tinned meat we have to eat every other meal, was quite delicious as a curry last night. September 8th. I hope I have not missed today's mail. I may have done so, as I hear our letters are kept for some time before being forwarded. In case I have, it will be September 27th or so before you get this, and I shall perhaps have started home on leave. And though, as the time approaches for me to go, I doubt more and more whether I can actually break away. The only possibility of real contentment now for anyone who cares for France or England is to stay until their just cause is victorious, or, as in many a case, alas, until the call to eternal peace. Every soldier is dreading the winter here, and secretly fosters the almost hopeless wish and belief that there will be no winter campaign. However, as day passes day and all preparations for one go forward to completion, the French, with their wonderful pluck and determination, will resign themselves to the inevitable. The other day a poilu, who was standing as usual with 8 or 9 others around my car at X, suddenly expressed this compensating thought: "Well, it may be hard for us French this side of Europe, but what a time the Boches will have in Russia!" And the idea quite cheered up the little party. Yesterday I had a sudden call to fetch 3 badly wounded. One of them was in great pain from a wound in the back, and the slightest jostle or bump I knew would cause him great agony. The doctor, pointing to one of the other 2, said, "You must get him to the operating room as quickly as you can." "But," I answered, "I dare not go fast. This poor chap is in such condition." The doctor shrugged his shoulders, but the man who was suffering had heard. "Go as fast as you can, my friend. It won't kill me." I did so, and the bumps were bad. The poor fellow could not help uttering cries from time to time. Before I arrived at Belleville the cries had ceased, as the great pain had made him unconscious. The badly wounded man was dead. "C'est la guerre," said the doctor to whom I told the story, and I left him washing his hands for the operation. I have just heard an amusing fragment. A German prisoner lately taken was seated in the telephone office at Montauville, waiting to be transported. He had stamped on his uniform buttons an iron cross, and the French were asking him why he wore it. He explained that it was the right of a section who had earned the Iron Cross to do so. The Frenchman started chaffing him. He could understand and speak French, and a jocular remark, not particularly complimentary to the Kaiser, was cut short by the prisoner, who, nervously looking around the room, said in an awed whisper, "Oh, if the Kaiser should hear of your talking this way, mein Gott!" The other day I paid a visit to the hospital at L, and found all the wounded (only very serious cases stay here) quite happy and buoyant, and the men who had been evacuated in my car never failed to remind me and thank me. One young fellow about my own age had had his left leg amputated. I sat by his bed and chatted with him, and he told me of his wife, a year and a half married, and of his child whom he had not yet seen. He was so very eager that somehow the pity of it made me turn aside for a second and look out of the window. Quick of perception, out went his hand to mine. "Oh, she will understand, camarade," he said, smiling. "She will love me just the same. She is a Frenchwoman." How can one help caring for France and French people? They have such keen appreciation of the value of sympathy and gratitude. Here, in the midst of torturing death, they, at least, are cheerful, and, having put aside the barrier of selfishness, are wholly simple and direct in their human relations. The fact that on every side there is daily evidence of this attitude, in spite of so bitter and costly a struggle, is high proof of the fineness of their civilization. End of Part 4. Part 5 of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front, by Leslie Buswell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. September 14th. Today the section and our section leader were decorated. The ceremony took place in the garden, and the Croix de Guerre was pinned on Salisbury's breast. The double kiss, given with dignity and a few words of congratulation to our section by the médecin divisionnaire, ended the notable event. So we now have hanging over our mantelpiece this coveted insignia. The section is not going to move from here. The General says it is one of the most active parts on the line, and lately, although the wounded have not been so very numerous, the trench bombardments have been so heavy that I anticipate more action. Did I tell you of the marvelous escape George Ritter and Walter Lovell had yesterday? A shell dropped 8 or 10 yards away from them in the road and did not explode. I wonder they didn't die of surprise. I don't know what our section would have done without those two. But everything happens to George, and he still has a whole skin, thank God. No letter from America has come to me for over 2 weeks, which is not very stimulating. Out here, molehills are mountains, and mountains impassable, and although it is of no real importance whether one gets a letter or not, or whether the letter one may get is cold or warm, yet these small and seemingly insignificant things are sometimes enough to send away sleep. I suppose the truth is I really need a rest and change. It has seemed to me lately that modern warfare means even more of a nervous expenditure than a physical one. The nights are getting cold, dark, and damp, the leaves are falling, underbrush turning, the icy hand of winter stretches out nearer and nearer, and the trials of the poilus are doubling every day. Yesterday I talked with a priest. He and most of his calling voluntarily accepted at the beginning of the war the fearful task of burying the dead. It sounds very simple, doesn't it? Do you realize what it means? It means handling terrible objects covered with blood-soaked clothing that once had the shape of human beings. It means taking from these forms all articles of apparel that might prove serviceable, and searching through these red-stained clothes for any letters or identification. Some of these shapes are hardly of human outline, very stiff and cold. Some are mere fragments, no longer of any recognizable form. That is a little of what burying the dead means. I spare you more detail. And this is the work the priests of peace are doing in France. Wonderful, you think? No, it is French temperament, French courage. The musician is now brancardier. The artist, the poet, the paterfamilias of age past military obligation, all digging trenches, or any work they can lay their hands upon. That is why France lives and has lived through all her agony. How often have we heard said, "Poor France, she will never stand this great calamity." She will stand 100 such calamities, and always come to the top again. Sunday. And for a Sunday, quite quiet. Of course, we had our usual bombardment, but only shrapnel. About 4:30 they started to arrive, and a call for 2 cars followed. I had to go to M, and on the way up there at the X I saw a horrible sight: 2 dead, 3 wounded, and a horse. A shrapnel shell, badly timed, had fallen exactly in the middle of the road and made a great mess. Schroeder and Willis were there, so I continued up to M, where I got 7 wounded. The American mail has arrived. Letters from you, Joe, and S. A feast. Monday. Serious bombardment of 3 villages. Schroeder and I were at Dieulouard, so for the first time missed it. It was a pleasant miss for us. Those who pretend they like to be in bombardments are either humbugs or have never been in a real one. Having experienced them more or less for 4 months, I dislike the sensation now as much as on my first day. It is an interesting fact that while the villages about here are under constant bombardment, many of the oldest civilians cannot be induced to leave their homes, preferring to risk death in their cellars. The other day a very old woman at Montevilla had an amazing escape. A 150 high explosive shell fell into the bedroom of a cottage where she was sleeping. The small room was entirely shattered, but its occupant was not even injured. When I saw her soon after, she was in an intense state of resentment over the destruction of her personal belongings, but her own escape did not seem to appeal to her. I heard a story yesterday which I have every reason to believe is true. I give it to you as I got it. Early one morning a soldier appeared in a boyau communication trench near here in the uniform of a génie French engineer, and started chatting with some passing poilus. He told them he was inspecting the lines, and they showed him round their trenches. On his tour, so to speak, he met some artillerymen who asked him to lunch with their battery. He accepted, and after lunch wandered about the wood with his new-found friends, who showed him the position of many guns. As night came on, explaining he had to return to duty, he left his friends and went to the trenches. It was now dark, and on getting to the first line he told the sentry that he had orders to go out and inspect the barbed wire between the lines. As that was in accordance with the duties of a génie, the sentry let him go. The man never returned, and as, on inquiry, the company to which he said he belonged did not know him, there is little doubt he was a German spy. Another story I heard from a friend of mine in the trenches near Soissons, and it is typical of the hopeless brutality we have to expect. When the trenches are very close to each other, a little advance post is dug so that one can hear what is being said by the enemy in their trenches. Generally, however, the distance between the lines is too great for this, and at night a soldier is sent out to crawl to within hearing distance of the enemy. One night a poilu so engaged got wounded, and when daylight came he was seen to be struggling to crawl back to his friends. 2 soldiers promptly started out to help him, but on reaching him the Germans shot and wounded them, so that the 3 men were now crying to their comrades to come and save them. Realizing that it was death to any one who left the trench in daylight, the captain forbade more of his men to venture out before dark. As soon as darkness fell, 2 other soldiers crept forth, but no sooner had they reached the 3 wounded than an illuminating rocket disclosed their positions to the enemy, and left 5 men lying wounded between the lines. As the captain could not afford to lose his men in this futile way, he detailed 2 sentries to shoot anyone attempting to leave. The 5 men lay there shouting to their friends, calling them by their names, reminding them of their friendship, and asking if they were going to allow their comrades to die thus without help. So that when 2 brancardiers came into the trench, they found the occupants in a terrible state of anguish and nerve tension. Not being under the command of the captain, and being Red Cross, they promptly left the trench to save the 5 wounded Frenchmen. 7 men are still there between friend and foe, but at peace now, God willing. September 23rd. On Tuesday, Ben and Willis and I went to Nomeny, a town some 15 kilometers away, the other side of the Moselle. It was a long walk. After stopping to put a wreath on Mignot's grave, we started about 1 o'clock on our journey. It was a very hot day. We arrived at a little village which at first sight looked deserted. We soon saw the reason. In the middle of the road was a large hole, a little farther on a pool of blood, presently 2 dead horses, a successful shell. Passing through Aton, the road goes on straight, ever straight, kilometre on kilometre. We passed the village and famous battlefield of Sainte-Geneviève on our right. Here, on September 8, 1914, 2 75 guns, a few mitrailleuses, and a handful of 500 determined French soldiers hurled down an attacking force of 12,000 Germans. Again and again the upright massed lines advanced up the hill to be leveled like bowling pins. After some hours of fighting, the brave little band of Frenchmen on the top of the hill found that they had no more ammunition, so with fixed bayonets they threw the last advancing Germans down the hill. The latter retired to Pont-à-Mousson with some 4,000 of their dead left on the hillside. These they disposed of by throwing into the Moselle. The French lost only 14 men. Apropos of this, I am reminded of a possible cause for the illness of many of our boys last June. Half the section are teetotalers, and the other half drink Pinard, the vin du pays, which comes from the Midi, and which is supplied to every French soldier. The water we were suspicious of, so Ned asked Mignot to ascertain where the chef got it. Mignot promised to watch and see whether it really was taken from the spring a little distance from the house, as we had been assured was the case. Imagine our feelings when he announced at breakfast the next morning that the water we had been drinking, and which had been used for cooking, was drawn from the Moselle. To continue, a little beyond we came to the battlefield of Nomeny of August 20, 1914. Along the roadside, dotted all over the field, are little white wooden crosses bearing the same inscriptions: Ici est mort un soldat français nombre tombé au champ d'honneur 20 août 1914. And here a more elaborate cross, a dead commandant, and there a cross marked Ici est mort un soldat allemand. We walked on, a silent trio. I was thinking of a year ago, of the wives and families of these heroes, already almost forgotten. Now we came to a little village surrounded with trees. On our left, some kilometers away, we saw the 75's bursting above the Germans. Sitting down with some soldiers who were taking shelter, we watched for an hour these 75's bursting, foot by foot, along the enemy's trenches. Again we started on our way and passed a hole cut in the road where a German shell had burst not long since. At last we saw Nomeny, a town of some 1,300 inhabitants, placed on the side of a hill and running down to the river Saille, where it ends as abruptly as it starts. Just a charming little town, harmonizing with the surrounding country as only French villages can. We made out the tower of the 9th century church and the walls of an old ruined castle. The sun blazed on the scene, and we stood there looking with true pleasure on this delightful evidence of French genius in combining architecture and scenery. The road curved to the right for some 2 kilometers. Here Nomeny is hidden from sight. A turn to the left, and there again it stands with its old castle. But what an illusion distance had played upon our sight! Ruined castle! Why, the castle walls are the only things that are not ruined. There stands Nomeny's skeleton. Not a roof, not a particle of wood remains, just the bare walls of the houses. We arrived at the outskirts of the town and presented ourselves at the commandant's bureau. A lieutenant offered to show us over the town. I cannot describe it. No words could adequately convey the sickening sense of desolation and desecration. Here are the facts. The 4th and 8th Bavarian regiments on August 20th decided to loot the town. Camions coming from Metz took away everything of value. Every house was burned, house by house, men, women, and children being shot as they tried to escape. Those who were in the basements of the houses were shot there, or burning petrol poured into the cellars. When the French arrived, our guide was one of the first arrivals, they had to bury 60 murdered civilians. Our long tramp home was uneventful, though very tiring, except when we came to the little village where we had rested and lunched with the 75s bursting some kilometers away. Here we found 2 trees across the road, and on making inquiries learned that the Germans had seen the General's staff car going along the road. Did I explain that the whole length of this road is in full view of the enemy? And seeing the car enter the wood and not emerging on the other side, bombarded the wood and were successful in wounding the General's chauffeur. Yesterday we went to Faillahe and saw quite another thing. This little village, a bit larger than Montauville, is as completely destroyed as Nomeny. It is true that the church was dynamited by the Germans, but here we have a legitimate excuse. The village was of strategical importance, and the absolute destruction was done after the evacuation of the civilians. The ruins look as different from those of Nomeny as could be imagined. No skeleton remains. It simply has been destroyed by shell fire. Hundreds and hundreds of shells, both French and German. The whole place looks as if some great eruption had occurred and leveled it to the ground. Whether it was necessary or not, I don't know, but here one gets the feeling of war and shell, while at Nomeny it is different. September 29th. Last Monday we heard the news of the English and French victory in the Champagne. The shelling of the French trenches in the Bois-le-Pretre had been awful all day, but when the good news spread, it sent courage to all the depressed, so that within a short time the woods rang with cheers and shouts of "à la baïonnette." Today lots of nice letters came from America. The last 2 days have been full of excitement, and we have been given an additional secteur to evacuate. Consequently, our section has been temporarily divided in 2. Mac and I remain in Pont-à-Mousson. An attack is expected daily, and with it will come the usual heavy bombardment of Pont-à-Mousson and the main roads. At present the rain has stopped everything, and the French and English successes will, I suppose, be checked, as the heavy rain will make advances almost impossible. September 30th. News came this morning that 40,000 prisoners had been taken by the Allies, and that 3 army corps had passed through the lines at Champagne. It all seems too good to be true, the first great good news the brave French have had for 12 months. Rain, rain, rain all day long. Therefore I do not expect we shall have immediate trouble here. The winter has come, the cold weather is very bad, and a night call is an unpleasant business. The other evening, when returning with an empty car, I asked a sentry whom I knew at Dieulouard, from which point onward we are allowed no light, if there was much traffic ahead. "Oh no," he answered, "not much. It is mostly past now." So with a good night I started ahead, and 6 feet farther on I ran straight into a horse. October 10th. Today I saw one of the most exciting episodes I have seen since I came out here. Several German aviatics and French planes had been flying over the trenches, and so many shots were fired by both German and French guns that there were at least 100 white puffs of smoke against the sky. About a half an hour after, 3 or 4 shells were thrown into the town, and I went up to the top floor of our house to watch them explode. A German aeroplane could be seen on our lines reconnoitering, when suddenly another plane, a Nieuport, came tearing down upon it. We gave a shout, "A Frenchman! A fight! Vive la France!" The Frenchman was now above the German in full retreat. Lower and lower dropped the Frenchman, always overtaking the German. Bang, bang, bang went the mitrailleuse. The German swerved, and the Frenchman was level. Now he was underneath. Bang, bang, bang! A yell went up from us all. The German was hit. His plane swerved, right side, left side, dipped, curved, dipped, nose to the ground, a puff of smoke. Something had exploded in the machine. It was now dropping straight to the earth, and finally was lost to sight in the woods of Puvenel. We yelled, we shrieked, we cheered. The Frenchmen had won. A dull roar came from the woods of Bois-le-Pretre, thousands of French voices cheering the success of their comrade. You may imagine the excitement at dinner when George Rader and Willis, who had not been with us, marched into the room triumphant with bits of the German aeroplane. October 13th. Yesterday was a serious day for us, and I had a bit of an escape. You will have seen, I expect, that we were badly bombarded, and that incendiary shells were thrown into the town. It was a Sunday. It is always a Sunday. Gott mit uns, I suppose. Well, about 10 o'clock I started off to pay a visit to a wireless friend with whom I had been learning to read. An aeroplane flew overhead, and I pronounced it to be a Frenchman. I was in the middle of the road when I heard the whistle of a shell a long way off, but strange to say, over my head. It came nearer and nearer, louder and louder. Have you ever actually experienced that inability to move which sometimes comes in a dream? I did then, for the first, and I hope for only, time in my life. Louder and louder shrieked the shell, and I just stood in the middle of the street paralyzed. I could not move. At last, bang! And then I ran like a bolted rabbit. Of course, it was ludicrously late, but luckily for me the aeroplane bomb, for such it was, dropped 20 meters from me on the other side of a stone wall. I need scarcely say I was ragged for my inability to distinguish a Frenchman from a German, but it is not so easy as one would imagine. After lunch, Ben and I went to pay a visit to some of our friends in the trenches, and afterwards walked through the first line for some time. About 3 o'clock we heard a heavy bombardment, the shells passing over our heads in the direction of the town. We walked to the edge of the hill, and sitting down watched the poor little place being shelled for 2 hours. The explosions of the German shells and the shrieking of the French ones as they flew overhead to silence the German batteries was most impressive. At last one shell came very near the house where Ben and I lived, and was followed shortly after by a second, even nearer. Ben jumped up, exclaiming, "Come on, I can't watch that any more. It is too close to our house, and I have a new winter uniform there." We returned to our friends' dugouts about 6, and had an excellent supper in the open, with stars and trees as a background, and a gramophone to provide music, 600 meters from the Germans. The other day we took another walk through the woods further back from those I have been talking about, where the Germans were last September. Shell holes everywhere, and old trenches marked the battle lines. Violets had already appeared, and I picked a few and put them in my fatigue cap. Passing along a little wood path, we came upon the inevitable harvest, 2 wooden crosses side by side, but different. One cross was more carefully hewn, and nailed to it by a bullet was a little piece of red cloth, the color of the trousers the French infantry wore at the beginning of the war, and which is said to have cost France several 100,000 men. The other cross was just 2 sticks, and hanging on it was a piece of grey-blue, a German. So here, side by side, a long way from town or village, in the silence of the wood, lie 2 nameless soldiers. Foes? I wonder. So the days pass. Now, with the evening, comes as often a grateful time of stillness. I like to watch from my window the shadows lengthen as the sun leaves to them their part. A little later, when they have wholly obscured all detail, man will perhaps furtively begin some move to make the night unlovely, but for the moment there is rest. An owl has just hooted, a musty old clock has just struck 6, a convoy wagon rumbling along the road raises a cloud of golden dust, then silence again. Lately I have discovered a beautiful garden full of fruit and flowers, where an old man still stays as caretaker. Schroeder and I go there often and eat the fruit which is spoiling on the trees. Sometimes, when the day's work is done and there is a quiet hour here, it is good to think of other gardens far away, where the salt air comes in from the sea, or often the fog, on these still summer evenings. I can understand now the lure of peace, and so I am doubly grateful that those of you for whom I care most have chosen to work, rather than to forget the struggle here. When I come back to you some day, we shall feel a greater peace and sympathy for knowing that with the same eagerness, if in different ways, we have tried to serve and to save those men whose heroism makes our best effort seem a very small thing. End of Part 5. End of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, Personal Letters of a Driver at the Front, by Leslie Buswell.